Welcome to Nightmare Lullabies. Here, we bring you chilling tales to keep you on edge while helping you unwind. If you enjoy our stories, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a new upload. Got a creepy story of your own? Share it in the comments below. We might feature it in a future video. Now sit back, relax, and let the story begin. My parents think I'm crazy for bringing this up after all these years, but someone needs to hear this. Back when I was a kid, there was this older man in our neighborhood named Mr. Leonard Chambers. Leonard was the type of person everyone seemed to love, friendly, always smiling, and incredibly helpful. He volunteered at shelters, always mowed his neighbors' lawns if they couldn't, and even set up lemonade stands for kids in the summer. He had this warm, grandfatherly vibe that made everyone trust him. For us kids, he was like a part-time grandpa. My friends and I would visit him often, especially during weekends or school breaks. He'd always have little gifts for us, candies, dollar store trinkets, and sometimes even toys. He'd joke around, tell us stories about his wild youth, and even took us out for ice cream once in a while. We thought he was just a lonely old man who enjoyed having us around. He didn't seem to have any family, no visitors, no kids or grandkids of his own. At the time, none of us thought too much about it. But my best friend, Alex, was different. Alex was curious, maybe too curious for his own good. He always wanted to know more about Mr. Chambers. Why was he alone? What did he do before he retired? Did he have any secrets? Alex wouldn't stop pestering me about it. Eventually, his curiosity got the better of me. Fine, I said one day after school. We'll figure out his big secret. But how do we even do that? We were just kids, 10 years old, and our big plan was laughably simple. We'd sneak into his house one night when he wasn't home and investigate. It was stupid, reckless, and incredibly naive, but we'd watched too many spy movies to think otherwise. So we picked a day, Tuesday night, 10 p.m. Sneaking out wasn't easy for me. My parents were light sleepers, and I'd never done anything like it before. But I managed to tiptoe out, meeting Alex at the end of our block. He, of course, had it easy. His parents worked late shifts, and no one was ever around to check on him. By the time we reached Mr. Chambers' house, it was dark and quiet. His driveway was empty, and the lights inside were off. We took that as our cue. Alex tried the front door, but it was locked. The back door? Also locked. Windows? No luck there either. Now what? I whispered, frustrated. Alex, being impulsive, picked up a rock and hurled it at the small side window. The glass shattered loudly, and I froze in panic. But no lights came on, and no neighbors seemed to notice. Alex climbed in first, and I reluctantly followed. The house smelled faintly of mothballs and old furniture. It was exactly what you'd expect from someone like Mr. Chambers, tidy, filled with knickknacks, and decorated with faded wallpaper. There were family photos on the walls, but they seemed odd. In every picture, the people looked different kids, different adults. None of them looked like they were actually related to Mr. Chambers. We rummaged through drawers, cabinets, and even under the couch cushions, but we didn't find much. Just books, old postcards, and more of those random trinkets he loved giving us. After about 20 minutes, I was ready to leave. But just as I turned to Alex to say so, headlights flashed through the front windows. "He's back," Alex hissed. We panicked, ducking into the nearest hiding spot, a coat closet near the living room. My heart was pounding so loudly, I was sure Mr. Chambers would hear it. The front door creaked open, and I heard two sets of footsteps. One was slow and heavy, unmistakably Mr. Chambers. The other was lighter, almost hesitant. I peeked through the slats of the closet door and saw him, and a little girl. She couldn't have been older than 7 or 8. She looked scared, clutching a small backpack to her chest. "Don't worry, sweetheart," Mr. Chambers said in a soothing tone. "This is a safe place. No one's going to hurt you here." Alex grabbed my arm, silently mouthing, "Let's go." But I couldn't move. Something about the scene in front of me felt wrong. The little girl didn't look like she was there willingly. Mr. Chambers led her toward a door near the kitchen. I stayed frozen in the closet as Alex slipped out and crawled back through the broken window. I watched as Mr. Chambers opened the door and led the girl inside. I waited until he disappeared before sneaking closer. The room he'd gone into wasn't what I expected. It wasn't a bedroom or an office. It was something else entirely. There was a mattress on the floor, bright lights, cameras, and a table filled with tools and strange equipment I didn't recognize. I could hear Mr. Chambers talking to the girl softly, telling her to relax and stay quiet. My stomach churned. I knew I had to get out of there. But as I crept back toward the window, I misstepped and knocked over a small lamp. The crash was deafening. "Who's there?" Mr. Chambers shouted. I didn't wait to find out. I scrambled out the window, cutting my arm on the broken glass in the process. I hit the ground hard, twisting my ankle, but I didn't stop. Alex was already at the end of the driveway, yelling for me to hurry up. As I limped toward him, we heard it, a scream. The little girl's scream. We didn't look back. We ran all the way home and never spoke about it again. I tried telling my parents, but they didn't believe me. "Mr. Chambers? Don't be ridiculous," they said. The police didn't take me seriously either. A year later, Mr. Chambers moved away. I don't know what happened to that little girl, and I don't want to imagine the worst. But I know what I saw, and I'll never forget it. If you ever meet someone who seems too good to be true, trust your instincts. People like Mr. Chambers are out there, hiding in plain sight. I grew up in a house that was built by my paternal grandfather in the late 1980s. It was a large, old-fashioned house with creaky floors, narrow hallways, and high ceilings. The kind of house that always seemed to hold on to echoes a little too long. My grandmother passed away before I was born, so I never knew her. I'd only seen her in pictures, and even those were scarce, faded black and white photographs that made her feel more like a figure from history than a part of my family. There was a strange rumor about the plot of land the house was built on. Apparently, it was shady, a term people in my culture use when something carries a bad history or negative energy. My family didn't believe in such things. They laughed it off as superstitious nonsense. But even as a child, I couldn't ignore how eerie the house felt. No matter how brightly the sun shone outside, the house always felt dim, cold, and heavy. This particular incident happened when I was 8 years old. At that time, my grandfather was living with us, and he was very old and frail. He'd been getting sicker by the day, and my parents were worried about leaving him alone. He stayed on the upper floor of the house, so at night, we'd all sleep upstairs in the living room to keep an eye on him. My mom, dad, and I would sleep in the living room, while my sister shared a bedroom with my grandfather in case he needed help in the middle of the night. That night started like any other. The air was warm and still, and the faint hum of ceiling fans was the only sound. I remember falling asleep quickly, curled up in a blanket between my mom and dad. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure why I'd woken up. Then I heard it, a faint sound coming from near the door to the staircase. It wasn't loud, just the soft creak of movement, like someone shifting their weight. I rubbed my eyes, trying to focus. The door to the stairs was ajar, and in the faint moonlight streaming in through the windows, I saw a shadow, a tall, human-like figure. The shadow moved slowly, deliberately toward the door. Then it slipped through the doorway and began descending the stairs. I thought it was my mom. Maybe she'd forgotten something downstairs, or maybe she was checking on something. I didn't think much of it at the time. Curious, I got up and decided to follow her. But here's where things started to feel wrong. The door to the staircase was supposed to be locked. It had a latch at the very top, a heavy bolt that I, as an 8-year-old, couldn't reach or open by myself. I remember staring at the latch for a moment, confused. It was wide open, even though my dad always made a point to lock it before we went to sleep. Still, I shrugged it off and stepped into the hallway. The staircase was dark, the kind of dark that feels like it's pressing down on you. But I could hear soft footsteps descending the stairs below me. "Mom," I called out softly. No response. I followed the sound of the footsteps until I reached the bottom of the stairs. The door to the ground floor was shut, so I knocked, expecting my mom to open it. I knocked again, louder this time. Nothing. I started to feel frustrated. Why wasn't she answering? I banged on the door harder, but there was no response. I turned to head back upstairs, fuming, ready to tell my dad that Mom was ignoring me. But when I climbed back up and entered the living room, I froze. My mom was lying right there, fast asleep beside my dad. I stared at her, my heart pounding. She couldn't have gotten upstairs without passing me. I'd been awake the entire time. I nudged her awake. "Why did you leave me downstairs?" I whispered angrily. She blinked at me, groggy and confused. "What are you talking about? You just went downstairs, and I followed you. You didn't open the door for me." She frowned, clearly annoyed. "I didn't go anywhere. Go back to sleep." "No, I saw you," I insisted. "You were walking downstairs. I followed you." By this point, my dad had woken up too. He sat up and asked what was going on. I told him everything, the shadow, the open latch, the footsteps. He listened quietly, his expression growing more serious. Finally, he got up and went to check the door to the staircase. When he came back, he looked unsettled. "The latch is locked," he said. "It's impossible for you to have opened it." "But it wasn't locked," I insisted. "It was open when I went through it." My dad didn't say anything else. He just told me to go back to sleep. But I couldn't. I lay there for hours, staring at the ceiling, replaying the events in my head. For years, I tried to bring it up with my parents. They never believed me. "You were dreaming," they'd say. "You must have imagined it." But here's the thing. Every time I mentioned it, their expressions would change. They'd avoid eye contact, shift uncomfortably, and quickly change the subject. It was like they didn't want to talk about it. A part of me wonders if they saw something too, something they didn't want to admit. Maybe they were trying to protect me, or maybe they were just too scared to acknowledge it themselves. I moved out of that house when I turned 18. My parents eventually moved out too, and none of us have been back since. But even now, all these years later, I can't shake the feeling that there was something deeply wrong with that house. I don't know what I saw that night, but I know it wasn't a dream. When I was about 9 or 10 years old, my family lived in a small town in upstate New York. We didn't live in the center of town, but a couple of miles outside of it, in a quiet area with just one neighbor down the road. It was the kind of place where nothing much happened, safe, uneventful, and maybe even a little boring for kids like me and my brother. One summer afternoon, my brother and I decided to set up a lemonade stand. It was something a lot of kids in the area did back then. We thought we could make some pocket money selling lemonade for 25 cents a cup. We spent the morning setting everything up, a small table, a pitcher of lemonade, a few paper cups, and parked ourselves near the corner where our house sat. It was a four-way intersection, so we figured it would be a good spot. At first, it was fun. A few cars stopped, and the people inside smiled and complimented us. They said things like, "You kids are so clever," or "This takes me back to my childhood." It felt good to get attention and make a few dollars. Then a man pulled up in an old beat-up car. I remember the way the engine rattled as it idled, and the paint on the car was peeling in several places. He stepped out, and something about him made me feel uneasy right away. He wasn't particularly tall or scary looking, but his smile was strange, too wide, too forced. He walked over to our stand and started asking questions, lots of questions. "How much is the lemonade? Do your parents know you're out here? Where's your house?" At first, I answered politely. I'd been raised to respect adults, and I didn't want to be rude. But as the questions kept coming, I started to feel uncomfortable. He was standing too close to me, and the way he looked at me made my skin crawl. Then, without warning, he grabbed my hand. I froze. For a second, I couldn't even process what was happening. My brother, who had been standing a few feet away, started yelling, but the man didn't let go. He started pulling me toward his car, and that's when my brother bolted for the house. The man's grip was tight, and I was scared out of my mind. I tried to pull away, but he was much stronger than me. Then suddenly he let go. I stumbled back, hitting the ground hard, and by the time I looked up, he was getting into his car and driving off. I didn't realize why he let go until I saw my brother standing on the porch, holding my dad's old baseball bat. He must have scared the man off just by showing up with it. Not long after, the police showed up. My parents had called them when my brother ran inside, screaming about a man trying to grab me. The officers asked us questions, but there wasn't much we could tell them. The man was gone, and we hadn't caught his license plate number. They told us to pack up the lemonade stand and go inside, which we did. I still remember how shaken I felt as we sat at the kitchen table, my mom hugging me tightly while my dad talked to the police. The man was never caught. He just vanished, and as far as I know, no one ever saw him again. Looking back, I can't help but wonder what might have happened if my brother hadn't run inside to get help. What if that man had managed to drag me into his car? It's a terrifying thought, one that still makes my heart race to this day. Angela and Ryan had always dreamed of becoming parents. For years, they talked about the names they'd pick, the first steps they'd witness, and the little milestones that would bring them closer as a family. So when Angela found out she was pregnant, they were ecstatic, even though their lives weren't ideal. Both Angela and Ryan had recently lost their jobs, victims of a rising tide of automation and layoffs sweeping through the country. They were surviving on government benefits and scraping by, telling themselves it was only temporary. It wasn't easy, but Angela tried to see the pregnancy as a blessing, a glimmer of hope in an otherwise bleak time. Ryan, on the other hand, couldn't shake the gnawing guilt. He felt like a failure, not just as a man, but as a soon-to-be father. As Angela's belly grew, so did their anxieties. Their baby's future loomed over every conversation, and their strained finances became a constant source of arguments. Angela pleaded with Ryan to find work, but he came back empty-handed every time. Despite the tension, they clung to the idea that they could make things work, somehow, for their child. When the time came for their 20-week appointment, Angela was nervous but also excited. This wasn't just any checkup. It was the day they would learn if their unborn baby wanted to be born into their family. The technology was new, revolutionary, and strange. A machine designed to measure the emotional and psychological readiness of an unborn child to join the world. The idea was that babies could somehow sense the environment they were being brought into, whether it was safe, secure, and loving. It wasn't mandatory, but many parents did it to ensure their child's well-being. Ryan tried to comfort Angela as they sat in the waiting room, his hands clammy with nerves. "The baby will love us no matter what," he whispered. But Angela wasn't so sure. She'd read the stories of babies deciding not to be born to struggling families, of mothers who walked into the clinic pregnant and left with empty arms. When their name was called, they followed the nurse into a cold, sterile room. The doctor greeted them kindly, then explained the process. Angela lay back on the examination table, her shirt pulled up to expose her round belly. The doctor attached small electrodes to her stomach, each connected to the machine that would communicate with the baby. "Now, don't worry," the doctor said. "Just answer honestly. The baby will ask questions, and you need to respond truthfully. It's all about establishing trust." Angela nodded, gripping Ryan's hand tightly as the machine whirred to life. A soft hum filled the room, and the screen began to display faint, rhythmic movements. The baby's responses. Then it started. A mechanical, childlike voice emerged from the machine, asking its first question. "Do you have jobs?" Angela froze. She looked at Ryan, who gave her a slight nod, urging her to be honest. "No," she said quietly. We're between jobs right now, but we're trying." The baby's movement on the screen slowed, as if processing her answer. Then it asked, "Are you rich?" Angela's throat tightened. "No," she admitted, "but we'll make sure you have everything you need." The next question came quickly. "Do you have a house?" "Assets." Ryan spoke this time. "We're renting, but we're saving up. Things will get better, I promise." For a moment, the room was silent except for the hum of the machine. Angela's heart pounded as she stared at the screen, waiting for the baby's response. The rhythmic movements slowed to a halt, and the doctor frowned. "I'm not seeing any further responses," the doctor said quietly. "Let's give it a moment." Angela and Ryan exchanged a glance, fear creeping into their faces. Then the baby spoke again, its mechanical voice colder this time. "I don't want to be born." Angela gasped, tears springing to her eyes. She clutched her stomach as if she could somehow hold on to the baby and change its mind. "No, please," she begged. "We'll do better. We'll give you everything, I promise." But the machine had already begun shutting down. The doctor removed the electrodes and stepped back, his face sympathetic but firm. "I'm sorry," he said. "The baby has made its choice." Angela let out a sob as she felt an unfamiliar sensation in her abdomen. Her stomach, once round and full of life, began to shrink. It was as if the pregnancy was being undone, erased. Within moments, the fullness was gone, leaving only emptiness behind. Ryan stood frozen, his face pale. "What just happened?" he whispered. "How is this even possible?" The doctor didn't answer. He handed Angela some tissues and left the room, giving them privacy to process what had just occurred. The days that followed were unbearable. Angela spiraled into grief, blaming herself for everything. "If you had just found a job, this wouldn't have happened," she snapped at Ryan one night, her voice raw with anger and heartbreak. Ryan didn't fight back. He felt the weight of her words crushing him, even though he knew deep down that it wasn't entirely his fault. Still, the guilt consumed him. Eventually, they tried again. Angela became pregnant within a year, but this time was different. They both agreed that when the time came to use the machine, they would lie. "It's the only way," Angela said firmly. "We can't go through that again." Ryan hesitated but ultimately agreed. They rehearsed their answers, crafting a perfect story to tell the baby. They had steady jobs, a big house, savings in the bank. It wasn't the truth, but it was what the baby needed to hear, or so they thought. When the day came for the scan, Angela and Ryan walked into the clinic with forced smiles. Angela's belly was round again, and she was determined not to lose this child. The doctor connected her to the machine, just like before, and the questions began. "Do you have jobs?" "Yes," Angela lied smoothly. "Are you rich?" "Of course," Ryan answered, his voice steady. "Do you have a house?" "Yes," Angela said, smiling through her fear. For a moment, everything seemed fine. The baby's movements on the screen were steady, even excited. Angela felt a flicker of hope. Maybe this would work. Maybe their lies could create a better future. But then the movement stopped. The baby's voice emerged again, but this time it was no longer soft or mechanical. It was deeper, guttural, and filled with rage. "You lied," Angela gasped, clutching her stomach as a sharp pain shot through her body. "Ryan," she cried, but he was already backing away, his face pale with terror. Her belly began to ripple and twist unnaturally, as if something inside her was fighting to get out. "What's happening?" she screamed, but no one had an answer. The baby's voice roared again. "You don't deserve me." Angela's screams filled the room as her stomach split open, and something monstrous emerged. It was no longer a baby but a grotesque creature, its skin pale and slimy, its eyes black and soulless. It let out an ear-piercing shriek before leaping off the table. Ryan stumbled backward, tripping over a chair as the creature turned its gaze on him. "Angela, run!" he shouted, but Angela was already slumped on the table, lifeless. The creature let out another scream and lunged at Ryan, but he managed to scramble out of the room, slamming the door behind him. He didn't stop running until he was outside, his breath coming in ragged gasps. To this day, Ryan doesn't know what happened to the creature, or to Angela's body. He moved far away, changed his name, and tried to start over, but the memories haunt him every night. He doesn't tell anyone what happened, not fully. Who would believe him? All he can do is warn others. Be careful what you promise and never lie to the unborn. It all started when I moved back to my childhood home. A small, creaky house tucked away in the middle of nowhere. The kind of place where you could count your neighbors on one hand and still have fingers left over. After my divorce, I needed a fresh start, somewhere quiet, somewhere no one could find me. My parents' old house seemed like the perfect retreat, isolated, familiar, and full of memories from simpler times. At first, it felt peaceful, but then came the noises. They started around sundown. At first, it was just faint shuffling near the edge of the woods behind the house. I brushed it off, probably deer or raccoons. This area had always been full of wildlife. But then the sounds changed. The soft rustling turned into heavy footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and uneven. And then there was the growl. Low, guttural, and unlike anything I'd ever heard. It wasn't quite animal, but it wasn't human either. The first time I heard it, a chill ran down my spine. I locked the doors and windows, telling myself it was just my imagination. But the sounds came back. Every night. And every time they got closer. By the third night, I couldn't ignore it anymore. Armed with a flashlight and a baseball bat, I decided to check it out. I stepped out into the cool night air, my heart racing with every step toward the tree line. The woods were eerily silent. No crickets, no rustling leaves, just an oppressive stillness. I shone the flashlight into the darkness, expecting to catch the glint of animal eyes staring back. But there was nothing. The beam of light seemed to vanish into the void, swallowed whole by the shadows. And then I heard my name. It wasn't coming from the house. It was coming from the woods. My name, spoken in my own voice. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, and that's exactly what I did. I bolted back inside, slammed the door shut, and locked it. I didn't sleep that night. The noises stopped for a while after that, but the feeling of being watched never left. Even during the day, I couldn't shake the sensation that something was lurking just beyond my line of sight. Sometimes, I'd catch a flicker of movement from the corner of my eye, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there. And then came the night that changed everything. It was around 2 a.m. when I woke up to a soft tapping sound. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from my bedroom window. My room is on the second floor. I froze, my body paralyzed with fear. The tapping was slow, deliberate, like whoever or whatever was outside wanted me to know it was there. Slowly, I turned my head toward the window, and I saw it. A face, pressed against the glass. It was pale and stretched thin, with hollow eyes that glowed faintly in the moonlight. Its smile was the worst part, unnaturally wide, as though its face wasn't meant to move that way. It stared at me, unblinking, as if savoring my fear. Then it spoke. Using my own voice, it whispered, "Let me in." I scrambled out of bed, my pulse pounding in my ears. I didn't think, I just ran. Down the stairs, out the door, and into my car. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely get the key into the ignition. Gravel sprayed behind me as I sped off, never once looking in the rearview mirror. I ended up at a motel 20 miles away. I locked myself in the bathroom with the baseball bat and sat there until dawn, too terrified to sleep. At some point, exhaustion won, and I passed out on the cold tile floor. When I woke up, the morning sun was streaming through the window. Everything seemed normal, too normal. I started to convince myself that it had all been some kind of stress-induced nightmare. I decided to go back to the house, just to grab some clothes and figure out my next steps. But the moment I stepped inside, I knew something was wrong. The house was silent, not the comforting quiet of an empty home, but an oppressive, suffocating stillness. The air felt heavy, and I struggled to breathe as I moved through the rooms. That's when I saw it. My laptop was open on the coffee table. The screen glowed softly in the dim light, and a document was open. It was this story. Everything I'd experienced was written out in perfect detail, from the noises in the woods to the face at the window. Every moment, every emotion, even my thoughts. But the final line wasn't mine. It read, "I'm finally inside.